Sarah's hands trembled as she counted the last of her coins. 7 cents. Her stomach ached with hunger, the kind that gnawed deep and hollow, like a slow, unrelenting ache she couldn't escape. 5 days. 5 long, desperate days without food. She had drunk creek water, eaten wild grass, and scavenged the last remnants from the root cellar before Clayton had locked it up tight. She had no strength left. No hope. The day had come when she had to choose between dying alone on the prairie or facing Clayton's cruelty. And still, she couldn't bring herself to turn back. The sun hung low in the sky as she sat on a cold wooden bench outside Mr. Henley's general store. Her body felt like it was made of lead. Every breath was shallow, and every movement felt heavy, like a burden she wasn't sure she could carry anymore. She clutched her shawl tight around her shoulders, hiding the bruises that marred her skin. She had been too weak to even notice the tears on her face until they dried in streaks on her cheeks. 7 cents, but it wasn't enough to change anything. Still, it was something. She had made her decision. She was going to buy a single biscuit, and then what? There was no plan beyond that. The town was close, but it was still miles away. She'd seen others pass through, and no one stopped to ask her if she needed help. No one looked her way twice. That was the way life worked out here. People either minded their business or they minded their own. She didn't expect anyone to care. But then a wagon rolled into town. The familiar sound of the creaking wheels made Sarah's head snap up. It was a sound she had heard before, many times in fact, but today it made her stomach twist in a strange way. She knew who it was before she even saw him. Ethan Crawford, the widower. Ethan had lived on the outskirts of town for as long as Sarah could remember. He kept to himself, a rancher, a man whose grief had carved deep lines into his face. Sarah had heard whispers about him, about how he had buried his wife 3 years ago under the oak tree on his property and never said a word to anyone after that. People respected him, out of pity or fear. Sarah wasn't sure. But he never came into town much, and when he did, he kept to himself. Quiet, brooding, always alone. There was a loneliness about him that felt almost familiar. Ethan's wagon pulled up in front of the store, and he climbed down, his tall frame moving with a certain stillness that was both unsettling and commanding. He looked at Sarah, sitting on the bench, pale and trembling. For a moment, their eyes met. Sarah felt a strange flicker of recognition, but she couldn't place it. The world around them seemed to pause. Even the sounds of the town, footsteps, voices, faded away. It was just her and him, a silence that stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. She had seen men like him before, men who came in with their intentions hidden behind their eyes, who took what they wanted and never looked back. But Ethan Crawford was different. There was something about him, something in the way he stood there, looking at her, that felt almost like he understood. And then he spoke, the words that no one expected. "I've got stew on the stove back at my place," he said slowly, his voice low and steady. "Table's too big for one person. If you want to sit and eat, doors open. No strings, no questions, just food." Sarah blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She stared at him, wondering if she had heard him right. Did he really say what she thought he said? A meal? No strings? A stranger, offering food without asking for anything in return? The words seemed almost too good to be true, and yet, there they were. They hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Sarah's mind raced. She had to be careful. She had heard enough stories about men offering help only to turn cruel when their victims were vulnerable. She had heard it all before. How kindness could turn to danger in the blink of an eye. Was this another trap? Was this just a man trying to lure her into something she didn't understand? But then, as she looked at Ethan, something about him made her hesitate. There was no malice in his eyes, no hunger for power or control, just a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. Maybe he wasn't like the others. Maybe he was someone who understood the weight of silence, of grief. She didn't know, but the hunger inside her was too strong to ignore. She looked down at the biscuit in her hand, her only food, and then, as if her body had already made the choice for her, she stood. Her legs shook beneath her, but she moved toward him, her heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. Ethan turned his gaze toward her as she took a hesitant step forward. "You coming?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't rush her, didn't press her. The decision was hers to make. She could feel the weight of the town's eyes on her, the whispers from the people watching, but she didn't care anymore. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. For the first time in days, someone had offered her something other than cruelty, something she hadn't felt in a long time: kindness. She nodded. "I'll come," she said, her voice shaky but determined. And with that, she climbed into the wagon beside him. The horse began to move, the sound of the hooves steady and rhythmic, and Sarah allowed herself a breath, a small moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't made a mistake. Ethan's wagon moved slowly through the dusty streets, and Sarah, sitting beside him, felt every bump of the road like a strike against her already fragile body. Her hands clenched the edge of the seat, her pulse quickening with each turn of the wheels. The faint smell of stew drifted from the wagon, a reminder of the promise he had made. But it wasn't just the food that had drawn her to him. It was the unspoken understanding in his eyes, the quiet strength that somehow made her feel safe despite everything. She wasn't sure if she was fooling herself or if this stranger had the power to change her fate, but either way, she had come this far. As they left the town behind and ventured toward his cabin, she felt the weight of her decision settling in. The thorns would come looking for her. She knew that much. Clayton's threats were never empty. And yet, for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. She dared to glance at Ethan, his face set in that familiar solemn expression, eyes focused on the road ahead. He hadn't said much since he'd offered her the meal, but there was a gentleness in his silence that was more comforting than anything she had known in years. His grief hung around him like an unspoken shadow. It felt like a grief she could understand. It was a loneliness they both shared, a burden neither of them had ever asked for. Sarah found herself wondering if, in some strange way, their paths had crossed for this very moment, as if the universe had decided that two broken souls might just be able to mend one another. The thought made her nervous, but also strangely hopeful. She couldn't stop herself from stealing glances at him, wondering who he really was beneath the layers of silence and grief. She noticed how he held the reins of the horse, his grip steady and sure. She noticed the lines etched into his face, the way his eyes seemed to carry a weight, a sorrow he couldn't shed. She felt a pang of sympathy, but also a pull of curiosity. Who was he, really? And what had he lost that made him so still, so closed off from the world? They reached the cabin after what felt like an eternity, the last of the daylight fading into a soft, amber glow. Ethan helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, and for a moment, she forgot to breathe. His touch was firm but gentle, as if he were afraid of breaking something delicate. She wondered if he could sense how fragile she was, how close she was to falling apart completely. But when she looked into his eyes, there was no judgment, no pity, just a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what it was like to lose everything. The cabin was small, neat, and simple. Nothing extravagant, but there was a warmth to it, something that spoke of years spent in solitude, lived in quiet routines. Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Ethan led her inside and gestured toward the wash basin by the hearth. "You can wash up if you'd like," he said, his voice as calm as the evening air. "I'll get the stew." Sarah nodded wordlessly, unsure of what to say. Her body felt like lead, each movement sluggish and stiff as she washed her hands and face, the water running murky with dirt. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she had felt truly clean. The soft light from the fire flickered in the room, casting long shadows against the walls, and Sarah took a deep breath. It was quiet here, so different from the constant tension of the Thorne household. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was walking on eggshells. When she returned to the small dining area, Ethan was already dishing out 2 bowls of stew. The smell of the rich broth made her stomach twist in anticipation. It had been so long since she had tasted anything like this. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then placed 1 bowl in front of her. She sat down hesitantly, her eyes darting between the food and him. He sat opposite her, spoon in hand, but he didn't start eating right away. Sarah, too, couldn't bring herself to take the first bite. The stew was steaming, rich with vegetables and meat, but her stomach was still too uncertain, too raw. She wanted to say something, thank him, maybe ask him why he had offered her this kindness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she picked up her spoon and took a bite, the warmth and flavor hitting her all at once. She ate slowly at first, savoring the sensation of something real, something that could fill her empty stomach. But soon her hunger overcame her, and she ate faster, more ravenously. She didn't care how it looked or how desperate she seemed. She was starving, and this was the first real meal she had had in days. The thought of stopping, of slowing down, seemed impossible. Ethan watched her, his gaze soft, but he said nothing. He just let her eat in peace, refilling her bowl without comment, letting the silence stretch between them like a comfortable blanket. When she had finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the warmth of the stew spread through her, bringing her back to life. It was more than just food. It was a small act of mercy, a reminder that not everyone was out to hurt her. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, embarrassed by how much she had eaten. She looked up at Ethan, his gaze still fixed on her. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite understand, but it wasn't pity. It was something else. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him for the food, for the kindness. But before she could find the words, something in the silence between them shifted. Ethan stood, pushing his chair back. "I'll be right back," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can rest here tonight. The spare room's yours. No questions asked." Sarah looked at him, the offer sinking in. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of this. A roof over her head, a bed to sleep in, safety. But she didn't know how to accept it, how to let someone take care of her without the fear of what might come next. She opened her mouth to say something, thank you, maybe, or protest, or refuse, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her voice lost in the weight of everything she was feeling. Ethan left, and for a moment, Sarah sat in the quiet, her hands resting on the table. It was strange, this quiet, so different from the noise in her head, so different from the life she had known. Maybe, just maybe, this was a place where she could begin again. Sarah sat in the dimly lit room, her hands resting on the chair arms as she tried to steady her breathing. The stew had filled her, but the emptiness inside her, both physical and emotional, hadn't completely disappeared. She felt safe here in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, but there was a heaviness in her chest, a knot that wouldn't loosen. Ethan had left to fetch something, and now she was alone with her thoughts. She glanced around the small room. It was simple, barely furnished, with a bed tucked under the window and a worn rug by the hearth. The soft glow of the fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and Sarah wondered if she was dreaming. Was it real? Could she really be here, in this quiet place, away from the thorns and the cruelty that had marked her life for so long? She glanced toward the door as Ethan's heavy footsteps approached. He stepped inside, holding a blanket in one hand. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "If you're cold, use this. I'll be by the fire if you need anything." His voice was steady, quiet, but there was something in the way he looked at her, an understanding, an unspoken connection. She didn't know if she could trust it. After everything she'd been through, trust had become a rare commodity, something she couldn't afford to give away easily. Yet, something about Ethan felt different. He didn't look at her like she was broken or something to be fixed. He didn't look at her like a possession, a burden, or something to fear. He just saw her as her. She bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she finally murmured, feeling the weight of those two simple words. Ethan nodded, then quietly left the room, his silhouette disappearing into the hallway. Sarah remained where she was, her heart pounding as she processed what had happened. She had eaten, she had been given a place to rest, and she had been treated with a kindness she hadn't known in years. It was too much for her mind to wrap around. Was it real? Was this just a brief moment of peace before the storm returned? She told herself not to get too comfortable, not to get her hopes up. The thorns weren't far behind, and they would come for her. She couldn't escape that fact. But at least for tonight, there was no fear of them. For tonight, there was silence and warmth and a roof over her head. She lay down on the bed, curling up beneath the blanket Ethan had given her body exhausted from the past days of struggle and hunger. Sleep came slowly at first, the quiet of the cabin unfamiliar, but as her eyelids grew heavy, she allowed herself to drift into a peaceful rest. Morning came quietly, the soft light of dawn creeping through the window. Sarah woke slowly, disoriented for a moment, but then remembered where she was. She sat up, stretching and feeling the stiffness in her body begin to melt away. Her stomach was full for the first time in days, and there was no looming threat, no cruel eyes watching her every move. She stood, the floorboards creaking under her feet, and made her way to the small wash basin by the hearth. The cool water was refreshing as she splashed her face, feeling the dirt and wear of the past days wash away with each drop. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin. Her skin was pale, her eyes dull from lack of sleep and food, but she noticed something in her reflection she hadn't seen in a long time. A flicker of life. A spark of something that had been buried for months, maybe years, beneath the weight of abuse and neglect. It was small, but it was there. She had never imagined that she'd find herself in a place like this. A safe haven, a place where she could finally breathe. The thought of what had led her here made her stomach tighten. The thorns, Clayton's cruel grip on her life. The memories of what they had done to her haunted every waking moment, and the fear of their wrath still lingered in the back of her mind. But for now, here, in Ethan's cabin, she could forget. She could pretend for just a little while that she was free. Sarah heard movement outside the room and froze. The door opened, and Ethan stepped inside, holding a tray with 2 cups of steaming coffee. His face was soft, his expression unreadable as he set the tray down on the small table. He didn't say anything at first, just let her take in the gesture. She smiled faintly, unsure of how to act, but the warmth of the coffee was undeniable. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the small comforts of life. Ethan sat across from her, his eyes meeting hers as he poured the coffee into each cup. The silence was comfortable now, unlike the heavy silence that had hung between them earlier. There was no tension, no expectation. It was just 2 people sitting in a quiet room, sharing the smallest of moments. Sarah took a sip, letting the warmth spread through her. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to help me." Ethan looked at her, his eyes steady. "I know," he said simply, "but I want to." Sarah stared at him, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Why was he doing this? What did he want from her? But she didn't ask. The words didn't feel necessary. There was something in his gaze that made her believe him. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't looking for anything from her except her presence. The warmth between them grew, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Trust. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe that not everyone in this world wanted to hurt her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here, a place where she could heal. She finished her coffee in silence, feeling her strength returning bit by bit. Ethan didn't hurry her, didn't rush her. He just let her be. And in that quiet, in that simple act of kindness, Sarah felt the weight of the past few days begin to lift, even if only a little. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The days that followed were a strange blend of normalcy and quiet tension, the kind of days Sarah hadn't known in years, and yet she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that clung to her every step. She stayed with Ethan at his cabin, helping with chores, cooking meals, and learning the routines that seemed so foreign to her. Ethan was kind but distant, a man of few words, his grief still an unspoken weight that neither of them acknowledged directly. They shared silences that were comfortable but heavy with the unspoken understanding of what they had both suffered. And slowly, she began to heal. Her body gained strength with each passing day, the bruises on her arms and face fading into memories, the pain of hunger becoming nothing more than a shadow. Still, she couldn't forget the thorns, couldn't forget that Clayton would come for her. She had seen the way Ethan looked at her, the way his eyes held a kind of quiet sorrow, but she also saw the way he was growing protective of her. He never spoke about the thorns, never mentioned what he would do if they came looking for her. But Sarah could feel the tension building. It wasn't just in her chest, but in the air between them. The calm before storm. It was a day like any other when she first saw him again. Clayton Thorne. The sight of him, standing at the edge of the property, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun, was enough to freeze the blood in her veins. Ethan had been outside, working with the horses, when she saw the man approach from a distance. His lanky frame was unmistakable, his features twisted in that familiar scowl that always seemed to spell trouble. She felt her heart race, a primal fear flooding her senses. Clayton had always been a threat, a presence that made her skin crawl, but now, standing in front of her with his arrogance and bitterness, he seemed to fill the whole world with dread. Ethan didn't immediately react, didn't turn to face the approaching figure. But Sarah could see the tension in his back, in the way he gripped the rake a little too tightly, the way his shoulders seemed to stiffen. He was aware, too. Clayton stopped a few yards from the cabin, his gaze fixed on Sarah. She stood at the door, her breath shallow, unsure of what to do, but knowing that her fear was giving her away. Clayton's eyes scanned her body, his expression darkening as he took in her appearance. "You think you can run, girl?" He spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you can just leave and find safety? You belong to me, and I'll take you back, whether you like it or not." His words hung in the air like poison, each syllable a threat. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. Not now, not anymore. She stood her ground, though every instinct screamed for her to flee. Ethan's voice, low and steady, broke the tension. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his tone calm but firm. Clayton's eyes flickered to him, and for a moment the two men locked gazes. There was a stillness between them, a moment where nothing seemed to move. And then Clayton sneered, stepping forward with a harsh laugh. "You think you can stop me, Crawford?" he mocked. "You're a fool. She's mine, and you're nothing but a man playing hero." Ethan didn't move, didn't flinch. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I'm just a man who knows the difference between right and wrong. She's not your property." Clayton's sneer twisted further into a scowl. "She's my sister's widow," he growled, "and she owes me. You'll regret getting involved in this." He took another step forward, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Ethan didn't hesitate. His hand went to the rifle resting on the porch next to him, his fingers brushing the cold wood of the stock. The action was deliberate, calm, but Sarah could see the storm building in his eyes. Clayton took a step back, his hands held out in mock surrender. "You think you can intimidate me with that?" he jeered. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Ethan leveled the rifle at Clayton's chest, his stance unwavering. "I think you better walk away, Thorne. I'm not going to let you hurt her." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the threat. For a long moment, Clayton didn't move, didn't say anything. It was as if the world had gone still, frozen in place, and Sarah wondered if she had stepped out of time itself. But then, with a curse, Clayton turned on his heel and started walking away, his boots crunching against the ground in a retreat that was as swift as it was angry. "This isn't over, Crawford," he shouted over his shoulder, his voice filled with venom. "I'll make sure of it." Ethan didn't lower the rifle, didn't let up for a second, but his eyes never left Clayton's retreating figure. It wasn't until the man disappeared from sight that Ethan finally relaxed, his shoulders easing. Sarah could feel the tension in her own body release, the fear beginning to ebb away, but it left behind a cold knot in her stomach. Clayton had gone, but the threat wasn't gone. Not really. It was just postponed. Ethan turned to face her, his gaze softening. "You're safe," he said, though the words felt fragile, like a promise that was still hanging in the air, waiting to be tested. But Sarah wasn't sure she could believe it. Not yet. She looked at him, her heart racing still, but there was something in her chest that wasn't fear anymore. It was a flicker of something new. Hope. She nodded, slowly, and he gave her a quiet smile before turning back to his work. But even as they resumed their tasks, the weight of what had just happened settled between them, unspoken. They both knew that the thorns weren't done with her yet. But in that moment, standing in the aftermath of Clayton's threat, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Ethan would stand by her. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to believe it. The days after Clayton's visit passed slowly, each one seeming to stretch on longer than the last, the tension between Sarah and Ethan palpable, though neither spoke much of it. Ethan had said she was safe, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Clayton's threat still hung over them like a storm cloud. Ethan worked tirelessly around the cabin, making sure everything was secure, repairing fences, and fortifying the small space as if he knew something was coming but didn't want to speak of it. Every so often, Sarah would catch him looking off toward the distant hills, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of concern crossing his face. He was preparing, even if he wouldn't say it aloud. She, too, had begun to feel the weight of the danger, and while she tried to keep her fears buried deep inside, they started to creep up on her, gnawing at her with each passing hour. The quiet nights were no longer peaceful, but filled with the ever-present hum of anxiety that refused to let her rest. It wasn't long before she noticed the signs. The hoof prints near the edge of the property, a branch snapped too cleanly to be accidental. Someone had been watching them. Sarah could feel it. And then, one morning, Ethan came back from town with a set of new supplies, nails, timber, more ammunition, and a look in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. She didn't ask him what he had learned, but when he spoke, she could hear the edge in his voice, the urgency he tried to hide. "Clayton's been talking in town," he said quietly as they sat at the table, the evening light casting long shadows across the room. "He's been making threats, telling anyone who'll listen that he's going to take you back, that you belong to him. He's been spreading lies about you, trying to turn people against you." Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She'd feared this, had known it would come, but hearing it aloud made it feel real in a way that she hadn't fully grasped before. Clayton's reach extended beyond the confines of his own home, and now everyone in town would know her name, would know the story he wanted them to believe, that she was a thief, a liar, a woman who deserved to be punished. She'd never felt so small in her life. But Ethan's next words gave her pause. "The sheriff says he's been pushing things too far," Ethan continued, leaning back in his chair, eyes thoughtful. "He's not stupid, though. He knows Clayton's dangerous. But he also knows he can't arrest someone just for running their mouth. So I've got to be ready. We both do." His voice was steady, but there was a hardness to it now, a resolve that Sarah hadn't seen before. She watched him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands fisted at his sides. He was preparing for something, and the thought of it filled her with dread. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. We wait, he replied, his gaze steady on hers. We wait, and we keep our eyes open. If Clayton comes back, we'll be ready. I'll protect you. I promise you that. She nodded, but even as she did, the fear in her chest grew. She knew Clayton wouldn't stop until he had her back under his control. It was just a matter of time before he made good on his threat. And that thought, the realization that she might have to face him again, made her heart race with panic. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's thin walls, and every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a branch in the trees, sent her heart leaping into her throat. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Would Clayton come in the middle of the night? Would he bring more men with him? Would he try to take her by force? The questions kept tumbling in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The uncertainty was worse than the fear itself, and Sarah realized she hadn't felt truly safe in years. Even the small moments of peace with Ethan were overshadowed by the looming threat of the thorns. She pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders, trying to steady her breathing, but the terror still clung to her. Outside, she could hear Ethan's steady steps as he walked the perimeter of the cabin, rifle in hand, keeping watch. She knew he would never let her down. But what if that wasn't enough? What if Clayton had enough men to overpower them? The thought made her stomach turn, and she finally gave up on sleep. She slipped out of bed, her feet silent against the wooden floor, and moved to the window. She could see Ethan's silhouette, a dark shape against the night, pacing back and forth by the trees. The cabin felt more like a fortress now, fortified and ready, but still seemed so small, so vulnerable. She couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was getting closer, that something was coming. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance, the rhythmic pounding of horses' feet on the dirt road. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her chest. Her heart skipped a beat as she strained her ears to listen, counting the number of riders. It was only two, just two, but she didn't need to hear any more to know it was them. Clayton had finally come. Ethan's voice, low and calm, called to her from the other side of the room. Stay inside. Don't move unless I say so. His words were barely a whisper, but the command in his tone left no room for argument. Sarah's pulse quickened, her body tense with fear, but she did as he said, moving quietly to the corner of the room where she could peer through the window without being seen. She watched as the riders drew closer, her heart thudding in her chest. Ethan was already at the door, his rifle in hand, ready. The storm was here, and it was time to face it. The men stopped just beyond the tree lean, their horses shifting uneasily beneath them as they stared toward the cabin. Sarah could see their figures now, the outline of Clayton's broad shoulders, Jesse beside him, both of them tense, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched low, staying out of sight. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was waiting for something to happen. Ethan stood just inside the door, rifle at the ready, his gaze fixed firmly on the two men who had come to claim her. Clayton's voice broke the silence first, carrying over the distance, rough and mocking. Crawford, you've made a big mistake. This woman belongs to us, and you're in the way. Sarah could hear the venom in his tone, the arrogance that had always made him such a dangerous man. Ethan didn't flinch. His voice, calm and unwavering, answered back, "She doesn't belong to anyone, Thorne. Not you. Not anyone. She's free." There was a long pause, and Sarah could almost feel the weight of the tension hanging between them. Clayton didn't respond immediately. Instead, Sarah could hear him mutter something under his breath, something about making Ethan regret his choice. Jesse, his younger brother, shifted uncomfortably beside him, his eyes darting nervously between Ethan and Clayton. Sarah could see the conflict in his face, the hesitation that was always there when it came to his brother. Jesse had never been as vicious as Clayton, though he had certainly followed his lead, letting fear guide his actions instead of his heart. But Sarah could see the shift in him now, the way his hands fidgeted, the way he stood slightly apart from Clayton. The tension was palpable, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she waited for what would come next. Ethan, unshaken, stepped out onto the porch, his posture relaxed but alert. "You're not taking her," he repeated, his voice low but firm. Clayton glared at him, his face twisted with fury, but Jesse's gaze lingered on Sarah, as if searching for something in her eyes. "You don't understand, Crawford," Clayton spat, taking a step forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. "She's a thorn. She doesn't get to make her own choices. She's coming back with us." Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle, but his voice remained calm. "No, she's not. And if you try to take her, I'll make sure you regret it." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Sarah thought the confrontation would escalate. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, the instinct to run clawing at her, but she held herself still. Ethan wasn't backing down, and neither was Clayton. Finally, Jesse spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Clayton, we can't do this. It's not right." Clayton whipped around to face him, his face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare tell me what's right, Jesse. This is our business, and you'll do well to stay out of it." Jesse flinched at the words, but he didn't back away. Instead, he met his brother's gaze and said something Sarah didn't expect. "I'm done with this. I won't do it anymore." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she heard Jesse's confession. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Clayton stared at his brother, his mouth hanging open in disbelief, as if he couldn't understand what Jesse was saying. Finally, Jesse took a deep breath and turned his back on his older brother. "I'm going to tell the sheriff. Everything. About Thomas. About the way you've been treating Sarah. I can't keep doing this." Clayton's face twisted in fury, but there was a flicker of something else there too. Something like fear. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, glaring at his brother and at Ethan. The silence stretched on until Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've made the right choice, Jesse." Jesse looked at Ethan, his eyes full of regret. "I should have done it sooner. I was too scared." Ethan nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Fear makes you do things you're not proud of, but you can't carry it forever." The words seemed to settle between them, a quiet understanding passing from one man to the other. Clayton, however, wasn't ready to let go. He took a step forward, his fists clenched, his face red with rage. "You think you've won? You think this is over? It's not. I'll find her, and I'll make sure she pays for what she's done. You're just a fool for thinking you can protect her." Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle, but Jesse stepped in front of him, his voice firm. "No, it's over. I'm done." The look Clayton gave his brother was one of pure hatred, but there was nothing more he could do. He spat on the ground and turned, his shoulders slumping slightly as he mounted his horse. "This isn't over, Crawford," he muttered, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. The sound of hooves on dirt marked their retreat, and Sarah, who had been watching from the window, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. For now. Jesse turned to face Sarah, his eyes filled with apology and shame. "I'm sorry for everything," he said quietly. "I never should have let him treat you like that. I'm going to make it right." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words felt too small, too inadequate for the weight of what had just happened. Jesse looked at Ethan, who gave him a silent nod. Jesse gave one last look at Sarah before turning to leave, walking away without a word. The cabin felt different now, the air lighter, as though the storm had passed. Sarah turned to Ethan, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. Ethan's eyes met hers, soft but steady, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something deeper, something that spoke of trust, of shared pain, and of something that might grow between them. "You're safe now," he said quietly, and for the first time, Sarah believed him. 3 months had passed since the day Jesse Thorne had walked away, leaving his brother behind, choosing truth over fear, and Sarah had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could belong. The cabin had become home in a way she hadn't allowed herself to imagine for years. The walls were no longer just a shelter from the world, but a space filled with life, laughter, and healing. She had found herself again in small moments. Washing the dishes while Ethan chopped wood outside, the warmth of the fire in the evenings, the sound of her voice reading aloud from the books Grace had left behind, the way Ethan's silence didn't feel cold anymore, but companionable. The deep ache of hunger had faded, replaced by a steady rhythm of living that she had once thought impossible. Ethan's steady presence had been a lifeline she never expected, but now it was something she couldn't imagine being without. It was a strange thing finding the person you needed in the most unexpected place, but that was what had happened between them. The quiet, grieving widower and the broken woman who had learned to survive, both brought together by the weight of their losses. And it had somehow, over time, turned into something else, a deep, unspoken bond that neither of them had dared to name until now. The first snow of the season fell gently outside, the world soft and quiet under a blanket of white. Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the landscape that had become so familiar to her, so full of promise and peace. It was a stillness she had come to appreciate, but there was something in the air today, something different. Ethan had been quieter than usual, a distant look in his eyes as he worked on a new bench for the oak tree where Grace was buried. He hadn't spoken much about her in the past months, but Sarah knew that the presence of Grace lingered in small ways. It was in the books Ethan read by the fire, in the way he kept the cabin tidy, but simple, in the respect he gave to the memories of a life that had once been full of love. Sarah had come to understand that Grace was more than just a memory to him. She was a part of him, a part of the past that shaped the man he was today. And in many ways, she had learned to love Grace too. Not as a rival, but as a woman who had loved Ethan in a way Sarah would never replace. She turned from a window as she heard Ethan's footsteps in the hallway, his heavy boots dragging softly across the wooden floor. He was carrying the bench he had built, the one he had spent weeks working on, and Sarah could see the care in the way he moved, the reverence with which he handled the simple, beautiful piece of wood. When he saw her, standing in the doorway with that quiet understanding, he smiled, one of those rare, unguarded smiles that had become more frequent since she had arrived. There was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He placed the bench down by the oak tree, dusting off his hands, and turned to face her. "I thought you might like this," he said quietly, his voice rough but warm. She stepped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders to ward off the chill. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, each flake a soft whisper in the quiet of the evening. Sarah looked at the bench, then at Ethan, feeling a lump rise in her throat. He had built it for her, for them. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the backdrop of the soft wind. Ethan's eyes softened, and he took a step toward her, his face serious now. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of something unspoken, something that had been building between them for months. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About everything that's happened." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what he was going to say, but she knew this conversation had been a long time coming. They had been dancing around it for so long, each of them afraid to voice the thing that had been growing in their hearts. He took another step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know I want to spend every day with you, Sarah. I want to build something with you. Something real." She felt her breath catch in her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice full of 1,000 unspoken words. I'm not perfect," he continued, his voice rough but earnest. "I've been broken for a long time, and I don't know how to do this, how to love again. But I know that I want to try. I want to try with you." Her chest tightened with emotion, and the words she had been holding back for so long finally slipped out. "I never thought I could have this again," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "but I feel like I'm alive here. With you, I feel like I have a chance. A real chance to be something more than what I was." He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his thumb brushing across her cheek in a soft gesture that spoke more than words ever could. The world around them felt as if it had disappeared, leaving only the two of them, standing in the soft glow of the snow, connected in a way neither of them had dared to dream. "You're more than enough," Ethan said softly, his forehead resting against hers. "You always have been." The words were simple, but they were everything. In that moment, Sarah realized how far they had come, how much they had healed together, how much she had come to love him, despite the scars they both carried. She closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped in the warmth of his touch, the sound of his steady breath. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the same tenderness reflected in his gaze, the same quiet understanding that had been there from the start. Ethan gently reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn silver ring. It was simple, the band thin but solid, and Sarah's breath caught as he held it out to her. "This was Grace's," he said, his voice quiet. "She would have wanted you to have it. I want you to have it." The air between them seemed to still as she took the ring from his hand, feeling the weight of it in her palm. She looked up at him, her heart full. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't imagine my life without you, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you marry me?" Her heart swelled with something deep, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the ring, the warmth of his words, the warmth of everything that had brought them here. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Ethan Crawford. I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something she thought had been lost forever: hope. The snow fell softly around them, and in that quiet moment, everything seemed possible. They stood there, together, in the warmth of their love, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. There would be no more running, no more fear, just the two of them building something new, something beautiful. And for the first time in her life, Sarah believed that love wasn't something that hurt, something that broke you. It was something that healed. The life they had found together was proof of that.